He carried a sack of vegetables on his back, whistling softly to himself as rain soaked through his thin, patched shirt. His shoes were worn through at the sole. His trousers were faded and frayed at the hem. He had nothing, absolutely nothing. And yet, he stopped in the middle of that muddy road, knelt down beside a crying child who had dropped her bread in the puddle, picked it up, dried it gently with the only clean corner of his shirt, and handed it back to her with the widest, warmest smile the village had ever seen. From behind the latticed window of the grandest house on the hill, a young woman pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. She had been watching him for 3 years, and he had never once looked up. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let us go back to that window. Her name was Miriam, and his name was Eli. Miriam was 23 years old, educated at the finest school her father's money could buy, fluent in 3 languages, and the only daughter of Solomon Adeyemi, the most powerful merchant in the entire region. Her life was arranged like the furniture in their parlor, perfectly placed, deliberately ordered, never allowed to fall out of position. She had suitors, many of them. Men who arrived at their gate in fine carriages with polished shoes and rehearsed speeches. Men who spoke of dowries and property and bloodlines. Men who looked at her like she was a plot of land to be acquired. Not one of them had ever knelt in the rain to dry a child's bread. Eli was 26. He lived in a 2-room cottage at the far end of the village with his grandmother, a small, iron-willed woman named Nana Ruth, who walked with a limp and cooked the most extraordinary pepper soup in the county. His father had died when Eli was 12. His mother had followed 3 years later, quietly, the way grief sometimes takes people, without drama, without announcement, just a slow fading. He had no land of his own, no inheritance, no title. He hired himself out as a farmhand to whoever needed the labor, carried loads at the market before dawn, and repaired thatched rooftops on weekends. Every coin he earned, he split in 2, half for food, half saved in a small tin under the floorboard. He was saving for what exactly he was never entirely sure. Perhaps freedom, perhaps dignity, perhaps simply the feeling of not being afraid. What he did not know, what he could not possibly know, was that every morning for 3 years, a young woman had arranged herself beside that latticed window with a cup of tea, waiting for the moment he would pass on his way to the fields. She knew his route. She knew his schedule. She knew that on Tuesdays he walked faster because the farmer on the eastern side paid by the hour. She knew that on Fridays he always brought something back from the market for Nana Ruth. Sometimes a mango, sometimes a small bundle of dried fish. She knew that he hummed when he was happy and went quiet when something troubled him. She knew all of this, and she had never spoken a single word to him. Miriam. Her father's voice cut through the morning one day like a blade through silk. She stepped back from the window quickly, nearly upsetting her tea. Solomon Adeyemi stood in the doorway of the parlor, a broad man with the posture of someone who had never once been told no. "Barrister Okafor's son is coming on Saturday. You will be ready." "Yes, Papa." "You will wear the blue dress." "Yes, Papa." He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You spend a great deal of time at that window." Her heart stopped. "The garden needs tending," she said evenly. "I was checking whether the gardener had come." Solomon looked at her for another beat, then turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed down the marble corridor until they disappeared entirely. Miriam turned back to the window. The road below was empty now. Eli had already passed. She let out a slow breath and pressed her forehead to the glass. What was she doing? What was any of this? She was the daughter of Solomon Adeyemi. She would marry a barrister's son or a banker's son or some other kind of son that her father had pre-approved from a list she had never been shown. That was the arrangement. That was the life. And yet, she thought of the way Eli had smiled at that child in the rain. Not a polite smile, not a performative smile. The kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep and unhurried inside a person. The kind of smile that costs nothing and means everything. She had never seen any of her suitors smile like that. She had never seen her father smile like that. That evening, she did something she had never done before. She wrote a note, folded it into a small square, and called for Amara, the youngest house girl, who was quick and quiet and, most importantly, said nothing to nobody. "Amara," she said softly, "do you know the cottage at the end of the lower road? The one with the old woman who makes the pepper soup?" Amara's eyes widened slightly. "Nana Ruth's place, Ma. Yes, I want you to leave this basket on their doorstep before sunrise tomorrow. Do not knock. Do not say where it came from. Can you do that?" Amara looked at the basket, a cloth-covered bundle that held yams, dried fish, a small bottle of palm oil, and something wrapped carefully in brown paper. She looked at Miriam. She said nothing. "Amara." "Yes, Ma, before sunrise." The next morning, Nana Ruth opened her front door and found the basket sitting there in the gray pre-dawn light, damp with dew. She stood in the doorway for a long time, looking up and down the empty road. Then she bent slowly, picked up the basket, and carried it inside. She never said anything to Eli about it. But 3 weeks later, when a second basket appeared, this time with medicine for the cough she had been hiding, she sat down at her small wooden table, folded her hands, and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. Meanwhile, Eli had begun to notice something peculiar. Small things. A loose plank in his fence that had been repaired while he was at work. Fresh mortar on the cracked corner of their outer wall. A bundle of firewood stacked neatly by the door one morning, dry and ready, just before the rains came. "Nana," he said one evening, setting down his work boots at the door. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Nana Ruth looked up from her soup pot, her face perfectly still. "Many things." "Which one?" "These." He gestured vaguely. "Things that keep appearing. The fence, the firewood, that medicine last month." Nana Ruth stirred the pot slowly. "Good things come to good people, Eli. That is not an answer." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "It is not." He stared at her. She continued stirring. He pulled off his boots and said nothing more. But that night, lying in the dark, he stared at the ceiling and tried to think of who would do such a thing. Who in this village had such means and such silence? He had no answer, but the question stayed with him like a stone in a shoe. If you are still watching up to this point, type "I'm still here" in the comments right now. It means more than you know. The rains came harder in October that year, the kind of rains that the elders called angry rains. Rains that did not simply fall, but attacked, sideways, furious, as though the sky had a grievance against the earth. The river at the edge of the village, usually a gentle, manageable thing, began to rise on a Wednesday afternoon with alarming speed. By Thursday morning, it had breached its bank. Water poured through the lower streets in dark, churning sheets. People scrambled, children screamed. Old men who had survived worse floods stood at their doorways and shook their heads with grave, unhurried certainty. This was different. This was bad. Solomon Adeyemi's carriage had been trying to cross the lower bridge. Why he had chosen that particular route in that particular storm, nobody quite understood. But Solomon was a man who did not adjust his schedule for weather when the bridge groaned and tilted. The driver jumped clear. The horse tore loose, and the carriage pitched sideways off the bridge and came down hard on the embankment below. The roof caving inward, the door jammed shut with Miriam trapped inside. She had been visiting the seamstress. She had not told her father where she was going because he would have told her it was unnecessary. She was in the carriage alone. The water was rising around it, cold and fast, black with debris. She screamed. She pushed at the door with both hands, both feet, everything she had. The wood held. She could hear the water getting louder, feel it beginning to seep beneath the door, ice cold against her ankles. "Help!" Her voice broke apart in the noise of the storm. "Someone, please!" The village scrambled around her in panic, people fleeing toward higher ground, carrying what they could, pulling children by the arms. Nobody stopped. Nobody could afford to stop. And then, he was there. Eli appeared at the embankment's edge, his shirt already soaked through, his chest heaving from running. He had heard it. He had been passing on his way back from the eastern farm when he heard the crash, and he had not stopped to think, had not stopped to weigh odds or calculate risk, had simply run. He slid down the embankment, landing hard in the rising water. It was waist-deep already and pulling at him with savage intent. "Who is in there?" he shouted against the door. I cannot get out. The door!" He threw his weight against it. Once, twice, nothing. He pulled back, looked at it for half a second, calculating, then drove his shoulder into the upper corner where the frame had buckled. On the third blow, it gave, suddenly, completely, and he stumbled half inside, grabbing for her hands in the dark. Come on, give me your hand, both hands." Her fingers found his. He pulled. The water swirled and shoved at them both as he dragged her out, one arm around her waist, fighting upstream through the current with every step. She was shaking. He was shaking. His foot caught on something beneath the water, a submerged rock, a buried root, and he went down hard, his head striking the embankment wall. She grabbed him. She had his arm before he could be swept back. She pulled with everything she had, screaming his name. Except she did not know his name, so she screamed, "Get up! Please, get up!" And he did, somehow, bleeding from his temple, half blind from the blow, and they stumbled together up the embankment and collapsed on solid ground in the rain. For a moment there was nothing but breathing. Then Miriam raised her head and looked at him. And Eli, for the first time in 3 years of walking past that house every single morning, looked back at her. Really looked. Not a glance, not a passing observation. He looked at her the way you look at something you suddenly, unexpectedly, cannot look away from. She was soaked. Her hair had come undone and was plastered flat against her face. There was mud on her cheek and blood, his blood, on her hands from where she had grabbed him. He opened his mouth to say something. He did not know what. Something simple, probably. Something about whether she was hurt. Then his eyes closed, and he lost consciousness. What happened next made the whole village talk for a year. Miriam refused to leave his side. She had him carried to the nearest shelter, the village hall, where the injured and displaced had gathered. And she sat beside him for 6 hours straight. When her father arrived, tight-faced and furious, she met his eyes with a steadiness he had never seen in her before, and said quietly, "He saved my life, Papa. I'm not going anywhere." Solomon looked at the unconscious young man on the mat. He looked at his daughter's expression. He recognized that expression. It was his late wife's expression, the one she wore when a decision had already been made, and any attempt to unmake it would be a waste of everyone's time. He left without speaking. The village doctor came, cleaned the wound on Eli's temple, wrapped it carefully, and said he would need rest and quiet for at least a week. Miriam organized this. She sent Amara back and forth with food, clean cloth, medicine. She came herself every morning before her father was awake, and every evening after he had retired. On the third day, Eli opened his eyes to find her sitting beside him, reading. "You are still here," he said. His voice was rough, barely there. She looked up. "Yes." He stared at the ceiling for a while, processing. Then, "It was you, the baskets, the firewood." She said nothing. The fence, the mortar, all of it. He turned his head to look at her. "Why?" Miriam closed her book. She thought for a long moment about the careful answer, the diplomatic answer, the safe and manageable answer that would make this simpler for everyone. Then she said, Because I could not think of any other way to tell you that I see you." Eli was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if he had understood. Then he said, very softly, "I have never once noticed you." "I know. I walked past your house every day." "Every day," she confirmed. He looked at her, that same look from the embankment, full and searching. "I feel like a fool." "You were busy," she said. "You were surviving." He swallowed. Then, very slowly, he said, "I do not have anything to offer you. I did not ask you for anything. Your father is a problem for tomorrow," she said firmly. "Today, you need to eat." She reached for the cloth-covered bowl beside her, and despite everything, the pain in his head, the soreness in his ribs, the terrible uncertainty of everything, Eli laughed. A short, startled, involuntary sound, like something coming loose inside him. It was the most beautiful thing Miriam had ever heard. Solomon Adeyemi was not a man who gave ground easily. But he was, beneath the hardness and the pride, a man who had loved a woman once with the kind of love that rearranges everything. His wife, Miriam's mother, dead 12 years. He had loved her against his own family's advice, and he had never once regretted it, and he had spent every year since her death slowly forgetting that fact. It was Nana Ruth who reminded him. She appeared at his gate one morning, small, limping, iron-backed, and asked to see him. His houseboy tried to send her away. She looked at the houseboy with an expression that made him step aside without understanding why, and she walked into Solomon's parlor uninvited and sat down across from him and folded her hands in her lap. "I am Ruth," she said. "My son was called Joseph. He died 14 years ago. You knew him." Solomon Adeyemi went very still. Because he did know the name, he had buried it, the way you bury things that are too complicated to carry. But he knew it. 20 years ago, he had been a younger, harder-pressed man. Not yet rich, not yet powerful, still building the empire he now commanded. He had been traveling a road alone at night when his cart had broken an axle in a ditch. The road was dark. The ditch was deep. He had been trapped under the weight of it, his leg pinned, no help in sight, the night stretching around him like a mouth. A man had come out of the dark, carrying a lamp. He had lifted the cart with his bare hands, braced himself against it, jaw clenched, every vein visible, and lifted it until Solomon could pull himself free. He had refused payment, had refused food, had refused everything except a handshake and a name. Joseph. Solomon had promised, standing in the dark on that road with his legs screaming and his heart hammering, that he would repay that kindness, that if he ever found a way, he would. He had found his way. He had built his empire. He had told himself he would look for Joseph. He had looked a little, half-heartedly. Then the business had expanded, and the years had moved, and the guilt had quieted itself into something he no longer heard. And Joseph had died, never knowing. "My son told me about you before he passed," Nana Ruth said, in the same calm, unhurried voice she used for everything. "He did not tell Eli. He said it was not a debt. It was a gift. He wanted nothing back." She paused. "But I am an old woman, and I have watched my grandson work himself to the bone his entire life, and I have watched your daughter look at him from that window every morning for 3 years. She tilted her head. "So I thought it was time someone told the full story." Solomon sat in his grand parlor, in his grand chair, surrounded by his grand things, and felt very small. Then he stood up. What he did next, nobody in the village expected. He called a meeting, not privately, not quietly, but openly in the center of the village, where everyone could hear. He stood in the square on a morning after rain when the ground was clean and the air was clear, and he told the story. All of it. Joseph, the ditch, the debt unpaid. He told it without omissions, without softening. Then he turned to where Eli stood at the edge of the crowd, and he said, "Your father was a better man than me. And if his son is half the man he was, then my daughter has made the wisest choice I have ever seen." Silence. Then Nana Ruth, from somewhere in the crowd, said loudly, "He is twice the man." And the village laughed. And the laughter broke something open that had been sealed for a long time. They were married 8 months later. Not with great fanfare. Not with a guest list curated for status or display. Miriam wore a simple cream dress and carried wildflowers. Eli wore a new shirt that Nana Ruth had sewn herself, 3 weeks ahead of time, in secret, so that she could have it ready without letting on that she had been crying while she stitched it. At the reception, Solomon Adeyemi danced. Badly, but genuinely. In the months that followed, Eli and Miriam opened a small school at the edge of the village, a one-room building at first, with 2 benches and a chalkboard and a door that stuck in wet weather. But children came. They came in 1s and 2s, and then in groups. And then parents began asking about evening classes, and a community reading circle formed on Saturday mornings. And before long, the one room had been expanded to 3. Solomon funded the expansion. He did not announce it or attach his name to it. He simply paid. He spent the last years of his life differently than the ones before them. Quieter, less certain, more present. He visited families in need without his entourage. He asked questions instead of giving pronouncements. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, the difference between wealth and worth. And every Friday evening he came for dinner at Eli and Miriam's table. Nana Ruth always made the pepper soup. It was always extraordinary. There is a kind of love the world does not teach you to recognize. It does not arrive with fireworks. It does not announce itself. It waits patiently on the other side of a latticed window for 3 quiet years. It kneels in the rain to dry a child's bread. It leaves baskets on doorsteps before sunrise and never asks for credit. It runs toward a sinking carriage when everyone else runs away. The village of Eli and Miriam did not become famous for its wealth. It became known, in the years that followed, for something harder to build and easier to lose. A kind of ordinary human decency that passed from neighbor to neighbor like a lamp handed from hand to hand in the dark. Money can build a house. Kindness builds a home. And love, real love, does not ask what you own. It asks who you are. Now it is your turn. If you were in Miriam's place, would you have followed your heart or your family's expectations? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, please like this video right now, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. We put everything into these stories because we believe the world needs more of them. Because sometimes, the simplest stories leave the deepest footprints on the heart. We will see you in the next one.